sailors, not soldiers, men of the sea, now fighting as infantry in the dust of a foreign land. Ahead of them waited a ridge of rock and fire. The Boers called it Graspan. The British would come to know it as the Ridge of Death. In late 1899, the British Empire was in a desperate race. The town of Kimberley, the diamond capital of the world, was under siege. Its riches and its thousands of inhabitants, including the powerful arch-imperialist Cecil Rhodes, were trapped by the armies of the Boer republics. Public opinion in London, whipped into a frenzy by the press, demanded action. The initial Boer successes at the start of the Second Anglo-Boer War had stunned the world's greatest superpower, and the relief of Kimberley became more than a military objective. It was a matter of imperial pride. To break the siege, a relief column of nearly 10,000 men was assembled under Lieutenant General Lord Methuen. His mission seemed straightforward: advance north along the crucial Western Railway line, crush any Boer resistance, and relieve the town. But the Boers weren't a conventional army. They were a civilian militia, farmers and hunters, but they were also expert marksmen, masters of fieldcraft, and armed with modern, smokeless Mauser rifles. They wouldn't meet the British in the open field. Instead, they used the harsh, sun-baked terrain of the South African veld, transforming its rocky hills, its kopjes, into natural fortresses. Just 2 days before, on November 23, 1899, Methuen's force had fought and won its first major battle at Belmont, dislodging a Boer force from a fortified ridge. It was a victory, but a costly one, and it taught the British a hard lesson about frontal assaults against entrenched riflemen. Now, only 11 miles further north, another line of kopjes stood across the railway, a natural redoubt between the sidings of Graspan and Enslin. Here, the Boers were waiting again. The stage was set for another brutal confrontation, one that would test the courage of hardened infantry, and most of all, the mettle of sailors thrown into a fight they were never trained for. This is the full story of the assault on Graspan, a battle of desperate courage, tactical blunders, and staggering sacrifice. To really get what happened at Graspan, you have to understand the men who fought there, because they represented two vastly different worlds colliding in the African dust. On one side, the might of the British Empire, represented by Lord Methuen's 1st Division. On the other, the fierce independence of the Boer republics. Lieutenant General Paul Sanford, the 3rd Baron Methuen, was the very picture of a late Victorian British general. A veteran of colonial campaigns, he was brave and dedicated, but his military thinking was forged in an era that was fast becoming obsolete. His plan was direct. He would stick rigidly to the railway. It was his lifeline, his only reliable source of water, and the only way to transport the civilians he was to evacuate from Kimberley. This reliance, however, made his movements painfully predictable. He couldn't easily outflank the Boers. He had to punch straight through them. His force was a mix of seasoned regiments. The vaunted Guards Brigade, Grenadiers, Coldstreams, and Scots Guards, who had taken the brunt of the fighting at Belmont, were now in reserve. Taking the lead was the 9th Infantry Brigade, comprising battalions like the 1st Northumberland Fusiliers and the 2nd King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, the professional backbone of the British Army. They were disciplined, drilled in volley fire and bayonet charges, but their tactics were better suited to European battlefields than the open veldt against an almost invisible enemy. British doctrine still favored massed formations and frontal attacks, a strategy that would prove devastatingly costly against the Boer rifle. But the most unique and ultimately tragic part of Methuen's force was the Naval Brigade. Formed at Simonstown from the crews of the Royal Navy cruisers HMS Doris, HMS Powerful, and HMS Terrible. These were men of the sea. The brigade, about 365 sailors and Royal Marines, had been landed to fill a critical gap in British strength, a lack of long-range artillery. Captain Percy Scott of HMS Terrible had ingeniously designed field carriages for several naval guns, giving Methuen's column a powerful artillery advantage. These sailors were brave, disciplined, and spoiling for a fight. But they weren't soldiers. They were unaccustomed to land warfare, unfamiliar with skirmishing, taking cover, or advancing in the dispersed formations the regular army was slowly, painfully learning. Their officers, brave to a fault, led from the front, their naval swords and rank badges making them prime targets. This brigade, under the command of Commander Alfred Ethelston of HMS Powerful and Major John Hulk Plum of the Royal Marines, was about to lead its sailors into a storm of fire unlike anything they'd ever faced. Facing them from the rocky heights was a force of around 3,000 Boers, a mix of commandos from the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Unlike the British, the Boers had no professional army. Their forces were militias where men from the same district, friends and relatives, served under elected officers, giving them incredible cohesion. Their commander at Graspan was the brilliant and wily General Coos de la Rey. Having taken little part in the battle at Belmont, he chose the Graspan kopjes as the ideal place for a stand. He understood this terrain. De la Rey was joined by forces under Commandant Jacobus Prinsloo, who had retreated from Belmont. They dug in along a 5-mile front of interconnected hills. The average Boer fighter was a product of his environment. Raised on the veld, he was an expert horseman and a crack shot. His weapon was the German 7mm Mauser model 1895 rifle. It was a masterpiece, bolt action, clip-fed, and firing a high-velocity bullet with smokeless powder. This meant a Boer could fire 10 to 15 aimed shots a minute without his position being given away by a puff of smoke. From hidden positions among the rocks, they could rain down a deadly and invisible fire from over 1,000 yards. Their arsenal was bolstered by modern artillery, including 4 75mm Krupp field guns and the new terror weapon, the 37mm Maxim Nordenfeldt automatic cannon, nicknamed the pom-pom by the British for the sound it made, firing a belt of 1-pound explosive shells. This was the force waiting for Lord Methuen. Not a disorganized rabble, but a modern, mobile, and highly motivated guerrilla army, perfectly adapted to the terrain. They had turned Graspan into a fortress of stone and fire. The stage was set. The disciplined British regulars and the eager, inexperienced sailors were about to walk across a 4-mile-wide killing field, straight into the teeth of some of the finest marksmen in the world. The ground itself was the Boers' greatest ally. The kopjes at Graspan formed a complex network of hills rising abruptly from the flat, featureless veld. The sandy soil, dotted only by the occasional anthill, offered virtually no cover. The main Boer positions sat on a cluster of hills east of the railway line, forming a formidable salient, a bulge, in their defensive line. The Boers were masters of concealment. They didn't stand on the skyline as easy targets. Instead, they positioned themselves just below the crest. From here, they were shielded from direct artillery fire, able to wait out a bombardment in safety. They could then crawl to the crest in seconds to meet an infantry assault, firing down on exposed soldiers climbing towards them. Their ponies, the key to their mobility, were hidden in the dead ground behind the hills, ready for a swift getaway. Lord Methuen's intelligence on this position was dangerously flawed. Reconnaissance suggested the Boers numbered no more than 400 to 500 men with just 2 guns. Believing this, Methuen was overconfident. His plan was simple: shell the Boers out of the kopjes with his superior artillery and then send in the infantry to mop up. The advance began at 3:30 a.m. on Saturday, November 25, 1899. The 9th Brigade, with the Naval Brigade attached, marched out from their camp. As the sun rose around 5 a.m., revealing the stark outline of the Boer-held hills, the British deployed for battle. An armored train pushed up the railway line, a mobile fighting platform that was a key feature of the war. The battle didn't start with a rifle shot, but with the bark of artillery. As the British approached, the Boers opened fire with their Krupp guns and the dreaded pom-pom. The shells screamed across the veldt, and the opening salvo killed 5 soldiers and 2 horses, a bloody announcement that the Boers were here in strength and ready to fight. Now the British Empire brought its technological might to bear. The Royal Navy's heavy guns were ordered into action. Lieutenant Dean of the Royal Navy brought 2 powerful 12-pounder guns off the train and began shelling the Boer positions from 5,000 yards out. Soon, the Royal Field Artillery's 18th and 75th batteries joined in. What followed was an artillery duel. The Boer guns were well concealed, but they were firing individually while the British batteries concentrated their fire. More importantly, the British were firing shrapnel, shells designed to burst in the air above the enemy. The sheer weight of the British bombardment began to tell, and one by one, the Boer guns were silenced. From Methuen's perspective, the plan seemed to be working. The enemy artillery was suppressed, and he believed the Boer riflemen must be shaken. He gave the order for the infantry to advance. He had fatally misunderstood his enemy. The Boer riflemen were largely unscathed, waiting patiently behind the crests. Realizing the Boer force was much larger than his intelligence had suggested, Methuen sent a heliograph signal back to Belmont, ordering the guards to hurry forward. But it was too late. The men of the 9th Brigade and the Naval Brigade were already committed. The assault on the Ridge of Death had begun. It was around 7 a.m. when the whistles blew. Across a front of several miles, the British infantry rose and began its advance into the building heat. Before them lay a coverless, sloping killing ground. The regular infantry regiments advanced as they were trained, in open order, making short rushes from one piece of meager cover to the next. It was a slow, grueling process, but it was the accepted way to cross a fire-swept zone. The Naval Brigade, however, knew only one way to advance: directly and with unwavering courage. They moved forward not in a dispersed skirmish line, but in a relatively dense formation, each man just 4 paces from his neighbor. Their officers, including Commander Ethelston and Major Plum, were conspicuously out in front, some reportedly still carrying their naval swords. To the hidden Boer marksmen, they were tragically easy targets. As they came within range, the kopjes, silent under the bombardment, erupted in a storm of Mauser fire. Bullets whipped through the air, kicking up dust and finding their mark. Men began to fall. The sailors, unaccustomed to this invisible death, were bewildered, yet their discipline held. They pushed forward. Captain Prothero of HMS Doris reportedly roared an order that would become legendary. "Men of the Naval Brigade, advance at the double. Take that kopje or be hanged for it." A torrent of lead swept through their ranks. Officers, picked out by their swords and uniforms, fell in disproportionate numbers. Commander Alfred Ethelston was hit and killed. Major John Hulk Plum of the Royal Marines went down, mortally wounded. A popular story later told of how his little Jack Russell Terrier, Dickie, was found guarding his master's body. Captain Senior of the Royal Marine Artillery was also killed. Within minutes, the brigade's leadership was decimated. Still, they came on. The sailors and Marines, now led by junior officers and petty officers, continued their desperate advance. They clawed their way forward, yard by bloody yard. By the time the remnants of the naval brigade reached the foot of the kopje, a mere half a mile from their starting line, nearly half their number were killed or wounded. The ground behind them was littered with the dead and dying, a testament to their extraordinary bravery and tactical naivety. Now came the final, brutal act. At the base of the almost sheer cliff face they paused, gasping for breath. The order was given. "Fix bayonets!" The chilling rattle of steel on steel was heard over the din. With a final, desperate cheer, the survivors, joined by elements of the Yorkshire Light Infantry, began to haul themselves up the steep, rocky slope. This was fighting at its most primal. Men scrambled up the rocks, using hands and knees, rifles slung, bayonets gleaming. The Boers on the crest above leaned over, firing their Mausers almost point-blank into the climbers' faces. For a moment, the assault faltered, but the sheer, relentless pressure was too much. Led by Lieutenant Taylor of the Royal Navy and Lieutenant Jones of the Royal Marines, the sailors and Marines surged over the final few yards. The Boers, who were magnificent shots but had a deep aversion to close-quarters combat, didn't wait for the final collision. When the British were just 25 yards from the top, the defenders broke. They fired a final ragged volley, then turned and fled, running down the reverse slope to their ponies. As the exhausted, blood-spattered sailors and Marines crested the ridge, they saw their enemy melting away into the veldt. They had done it. They had taken the ridge of death. The position was theirs, but the cost was written on the rocks around them and on the plain below. As the British soldiers poured over the crest, they found the Boer trenches empty, save for the dead and wounded who couldn't escape. 21 Boer bodies were found on the position, and a nearby field hospital with 30 wounded was captured. Total Boer losses were estimated to be around 220 dead and wounded. The surviving Boers executed a masterful fighting retreat. As they streamed towards their waiting ponies, they kept up a harassing fire. The small contingent of British mounted troops tried to pursue, but came under heavy fire from another kopje, forcing them to pull back. The Boers had lost the position, but they had inflicted grievous harm on the British and kept their army intact, ready to fight another day. For the British, the aftermath was a scene of grim accounting. The total British casualties amounted to 20 killed and 165 wounded. But what truly stood out was the disproportionate suffering of the Naval Brigade. Out of their small contingent of 365 men, they had lost 101 in casualties, 3 officers killed and several others wounded. It was a brutal price for their gallantry and their inexperience in land warfare. The image of sailors charging a fortified hill became a powerful symbol of heroism back in Britain, but for the military, it was a sobering lesson. Queen Victoria herself sent a telegram expressing her congratulations on their gallant conduct and at the same time, the Queen's regret at the losses sustained by the brigade. Memorials would later be erected to honor their sacrifice, ensuring the sailors who fell at the ridge of death would not be forgotten. So what did the Battle of Graspan achieve? Tactically, it was a British victory. Lord Methuen had dislodged the Boer force, and the way north along the railway was clear. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The battle exposed, for the second time in 3 days, the fundamental weaknesses of British tactics. Frontal attacks against entrenched modern riflemen were suicidal, and the British lack of cavalry meant they couldn't exploit their victories. They could drive the Boers from a position, but they couldn't destroy them. The Boers, in contrast, were learning. They saw they could inflict punishing casualties, bleed the British column, and then withdraw. Each victory for Methuen was costing him men he couldn't easily replace. Graspan wasn't a decisive battle. It was a bloody stepping stone on the long road to Kimberley. For Methuen's exhausted soldiers, it was just one more ridge taken, with the knowledge that more lay ahead. The column pushed on, and just 3 days later, they would meet de la Rey's forces again in a far larger and more brutal confrontation at the Modder River. Beyond that lay Magersfontein, a battle that would turn the painful lessons of Belmont and Graspan into a national disaster for the British Empire. The charge at Graspan, immortalized as a moment of supreme courage, was also a tragic foreshadowing. It showed that bravery alone wasn't enough to win this new kind of war. The Ridge of Death stands as a monument to the sailors who fought as soldiers, and a grim milestone in the British Army's painful education on the battlefields of South Africa. The Second Boer War was a conflict that changed the British Empire forever, filled with stories of incredible bravery and tactical innovation. To learn more about the pivotal battles that defined this era, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you're interested in another story of desperate courage from this war, check out our video on the Siege of Mafeking, linked here. In military history, the Battle of Graspan is often overshadowed by the larger, more disastrous fights that came after. It doesn't have the iconic tragedy of Spion-Kop or the strategic shock of Magersfontein. Yet, to forget Graspan is to miss a crucial chapter in the story of the Second Boer War. It was here, on this sun-scorched ridge, that the brutal patterns of the conflict were set in stone. The battle confirmed the deadly effectiveness of the Boer soldier, his marksmanship, his mobility, and his brilliant use of terrain. At the same time, it laid bare the tactical shortcomings of a British army struggling to transition from colonial policing to modern warfare. The high casualties suffered in what was technically a victory showed that the road to Kimberley would be paved with British blood. Most of all, Graspan is the story of the naval brigade. It's the story of men of the sea, thrust into a fight on land they were never meant for. Their charge was a magnificent, terrible spectacle of disciplined courage that captured the public's imagination. But it was also a tragedy born of necessity and inexperience. The names of Commander Ethelston and Major Plum, and the 100 sailors and Marines who fell with them, are a testament to a hard truth. In war, valor is no substitute for tactics. The Ridge of Death earned its name, and in doing so, it etched a small but profound lesson into the heart of an empire, learning the staggering cost of underestimating its foe.